On the morning of October 8, 2023, the day after Hamas militants tore through the border fence, separating Gaza from southern Israel, and killed nearly 1,200 people, intelligence analysts in Washington, Tel Aviv, and London sat in emergency briefings trying to answer a single question. How did a group confined to a small blockaded strip of territory under relentless surveillance and economic pressure for 2 decades manage to execute the most sophisticated and devastating attack on Israeli soil since the founding of the state? The answer, as those analysts quickly understood, was not found in Gaza. It was not found in the tunnels beneath Rafah or in the training camps near Khan Yunis. The answer was found in Tehran, and more specifically in the mind of one man who had spent 35 years building brick by brick, dollar by dollar, the most elaborate shadow network the modern Middle East had ever seen. That man was Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, and what happened on October 7 was not a surprise attack. It was the culmination of a strategy patient and deliberate that had been in motion since the very first months of his rule. To understand how Khamenei became the architect of chaos across the Middle East, it is necessary to understand what he inherited when he assumed power in June 1989, and more importantly, what he feared. The Islamic Republic of Iran had just survived an 8-year war with Iraq that had killed over 1 million people, exhausted the economy, and left the country diplomatically isolated. The Soviet Union was collapsing to the north. The United States remained deeply hostile following the hostage crisis of 1979 and 1980, and Israel sat across the region as a nuclear-armed state with one of the most capable conventional militaries on earth. Iran's own conventional army was depleted, its air force was aging, and its ability to deter powerful adversaries through direct military confrontation was, by any honest assessment, severely limited. Khamenei, a man who had survived an assassination attempt that left his right arm nearly paralyzed and his voice permanently damaged, understood something about power that many of his contemporaries did not. A weak man does not fight a strong man on the strong man's terms. He fights on different terms entirely. He fights from the shadows through other people, in other countries, at a cost that his adversary finds too diffuse and too ambiguous to respond to directly. This was not a new idea in the history of warfare, but what Khamenei proceeded to do over the following 3.5 decades was to execute this idea with a consistency, a discipline, and a financial commitment that transformed the entire balance of power across the Middle East. The prototype for what would become known as the axis of resistance already existed when Khamenei came to power. Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militia, had been founded in 1982, 7 years before Khamenei became supreme leader in the immediate aftermath of Israel's invasion of Lebanon. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps officers had traveled to the Bekaa Valley in eastern Lebanon and worked alongside Lebanese Shia clerics to build an armed organization that combined military capability with social services, political participation, and religious ideology. The founding of Hezbollah was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential acts of the Islamic Republic in its early years, and when Khamenei assumed power, he looked at what Hezbollah had become and saw not just a single militia, but a model, a blueprint that he could replicate across the region, wherever the conditions were favorable. What made Hezbollah so valuable to Khamenei was precisely what made it so difficult for Iran's adversaries to confront. It was not part of the Iranian state. It could not be sanctioned as Iran could be sanctioned. It could not be deterred through threats against Iranian territory. If Israel struck Hezbollah positions in Lebanon, Iran did not have to respond directly, and yet Iranian interests were still being served, Israeli resources were still being consumed, and the pressure on Israel's northern border was still being maintained. Hezbollah gave Khamenei the ability to wage war without fighting to exert influence, without taking responsibility, and to advance Iranian strategic interests, while keeping just enough calculated distance to prevent a direct confrontation that Iran could not win. Over the course of the 1990s, Khamenei deepened and expanded this relationship. Iran poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Hezbollah, annually providing it with funding, weapons training, and strategic direction. By 2006, when Hezbollah fought a 34-day war against Israel that ended without a decisive Israeli victory, the organization had become a military force capable of firing thousands of rockets into Israeli territory, displacing entire communities in the north of the country, and absorbing Israeli ground assaults without collapsing. The Iranian investment in Hezbollah, made over 2 decades under Khamenei's direction, had fundamentally altered the military balance on Israel's northern border. This was not an accident. It was the intended outcome of a strategy. But Hezbollah, for all its value, was a Shia organization embedded in a Shia community in a country with a significant Shia population. If Khamenei's ambitions were truly regional, if he wanted to surround Israel, exhaust the United States, and establish Iran as the dominant power in the Middle East, he needed to reach beyond the Shia world. And this is where the most counterintuitive and underappreciated decision of his entire career comes into focus. In the early 1990s, Khamenei began supporting Hamas, a Sunni Islamist organization that had been founded during the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987. Hamas had no theological affinity with Shia Iran. Its members did not follow the same branch of Islam. They had no shared sectarian identity with the clerics in Tehran. And yet, Khamenei recognized that Hamas had something more important than theology. It had a cause, the liberation of Palestine, that resonated across the entire Muslim world, Shia and Sunni alike, and that gave Iran a vehicle to project influence into the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a way that no purely Shia organization ever could. By the mid-1990s, Iran was channeling up to $50 million a year to Hamas. IRGC officers and Hezbollah trainers were teaching Hamas engineers how to manufacture rockets from everyday materials, sugar and pipes, enabling Gaza-based militants to begin domestic weapons production. General Qasem Soleimani, who would become the most important military figure in the execution of Khamenei's shadow network strategy, personally traveled to Gaza to advise Hamas commanders on tunnel construction and defensive planning. When Hamas fighters were deported to Lebanon in 1992, they were hosted by Hezbollah and taught the tactics of suicide bombing, a method that Hezbollah had pioneered. The knowledge transfer was deliberate and systematic. Khamenei was not simply funding a militia. He was building a military capability patient and persistent in the territory that bordered Israel from the south. The scale of this investment grew with each passing decade. By 2008, Iranian funding to Hamas had reached as high as $300 million per year. By 2023, according to Israeli intelligence assessments, that figure had risen to $350 million annually. Across all of its proxies and allied groups, the United States State Department estimated that Iran was spending more than $16 billion per year to support armed organizations, foreign regimes, and destabilization campaigns throughout the region. To put that number in context, Iran's economy is approximately 1/50th the size of the American economy, and yet it was committing resources at this scale year after year while its own population endured crippling sanctions, unemployment running at 10% or higher, and an inflation rate that had decimated the purchasing power of ordinary Iranian families. Khamenei's economic and budgetary philosophy, as described by analysts who studied his government closely, was to use every available resource to fund the foreign policy of resistance, leaving the bare minimum for the functioning of the state and leaving the material needs of the Iranian people almost entirely to one side. This matters not only as a commentary on the nature of Khamenei's governance, but because it illuminates the depth of his strategic commitment. Leaders who fund shadow networks as a short-term tactical measure do not sustain that funding across 4 decades under punishing economic pressure. The level of investment that Khamenei maintained in his regional network was the level of investment of someone who genuinely believed, with the conviction of a man shaped by assassination attempts and decades of opposition to authority, that this strategy was existential, that Iran's survival and regional dominance depended on it. The expansion of the network continued into the 2000s with the emergence of Iranian-backed Shia militias in Iraq following the American invasion of 2003. The overthrow of Saddam Hussein, Iran's most dangerous regional enemy, had been achieved not by Iran, but by the United States, and yet it was Iran that benefited most from its aftermath. The Shia majority in Iraq, long suppressed under Saddam, now had political expression, and Khamenei moved quickly to ensure that a significant portion of that expression was channeled through organizations loyal to Tehran.
Groups like Kataib, Hezbollah, and Asa ibn al-Ha received Iranian funding, training, and weapons.
They embedded themselves in Iraqi politics while maintaining parallel military capabilities. In practical terms, Khamenei had achieved, without firing a single Iranian soldier into Iraq, a degree of influence over his Western neighbor that would have seemed unimaginable during the years of the Iran-Iraq War. By the time the Yemen civil war broke out in 2014, the pattern was well established. The Houthis Zaidi Shia movement in Yemen's mountainous north had been receiving Iranian support since as far back as 2009. When they swept south and took control of the capital, Sana'a, displacing the internationally recognized government, Iran saw an opportunity that it moved quickly to exploit. The IRGC began providing the Houthis with ballistic missiles, drones, and technical expertise, transforming what had been a local rebel movement into a regional military force capable of striking targets in Saudi Arabia and crucially disrupting shipping in the Red Sea. Iran had now established a significant presence on the southwestern flank of the Arabian Peninsula, threatening the trade routes through the Bab al-Mandab Strait and the Suez Canal, through which roughly 12% of global trade passed annually. The strategic logic was consistent with everything Khamenei had been doing since 1989. Find a local conflict, find a local actor with compatible interests, provide that actor with the resources it needs to become genuinely dangerous, and use the resulting threat as leverage. At the height of its power, in the years immediately before October 2023, Khamenei's regional network was genuinely formidable. Hezbollah maintained an arsenal estimated at 150,000 missiles and rockets, more than the combined missile stockpile of most conventional European armies. Hamas controlled the Gaza Strip and had built a tunnel network 360 kilometers long beneath it, an underground city designed for exactly the kind of sustained conflict that would unfold in 2023 and 2024. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Houthis controlled the majority of Yemen's population centers. Syria under Bashar al-Assad, who had been kept in power in part by Hezbollah fighters and Iranian support, served as a land bridge connecting Iran through Iraq and Syria to Lebanon, allowing weapons and personnel to move across the region. Tehran, Damascus, Baghdad, Beirut, and Sana'a senior Iranian officials spoke openly about controlling 4 Arab capitals, and the boast was not entirely empty. The man who made all of this work operationally, the figure who translated Khamenei's strategic vision into the operational reality of trained fighters, smuggled weapons, and coordinated campaigns, was Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the IRGC's Quds force. Soleimani was, by all accounts, a brilliant operational commander, a man who could sit in the same room with the leaders of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi movement and find the threads of shared interest that allowed them to coordinate despite their theological differences and conflicting priorities. He was the connective tissue of the axis of resistance, the man who flew from Tehran to Beirut to Baghdad to Damascus with cash weapons plans and strategic instructions, personalizing the relationships that held the network together. When an American drone strike killed Soleimani in Baghdad in January 2020, analysts debated whether the network could survive without him. The events of October 7, 2023 suggested that the architecture he had helped build was resilient enough to function without its most important human operator. And then, with remarkable speed, the architecture began to collapse. The October 7 attack, which Hamas presented to the world as a stunning tactical success, turned out to be the trigger for a sequence of events that Khamenei had not adequately prepared for. Israel's military response in Gaza was devastating and sustained in a way that previous conflicts had not been. In 2024, Israel's intelligence services executed an operation so audacious that it stunned even veteran analysts, intercepting thousands of walkie-talkie devices used by Hezbollah members across Lebanon and converting them into explosives that detonated, simultaneously killing and maiming hundreds of fighters and effectively dismantling the organization's operational communications at a stroke. This was followed by targeted assassinations of Hezbollah's senior leadership, including Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, who had been Khamenei's most trusted and effective regional ally for 3 decades. Hamas's own leadership was systematically eliminated. The Assad regime in Syria, which had survived more than a decade of civil war with Iranian support, fell in late 2024 to rebel forces severing the land corridor that connected Tehran to the Mediterranean. By early 2026, the network that Khamenei had spent 35 years building at a cost measured in tens of billions of dollars and in the deferred aspirations of 90 million Iranian citizens had been largely dismantled. The allied groups were degraded. The land bridge was broken. Iran itself had been struck directly by Israeli and American forces. And Khamenei, the man who had once sat at the center of a web of armed organizations spanning 5 countries, was by February 2026 reportedly in hiding, relaying succession instructions, no longer the commanding strategist but a fugitive in his own capital. The question that history will ask of Ali Khamenei is not whether his strategy was sophisticated, because it was. It is not whether he was patient and committed, because across 4 decades of sanctions, international isolation, and domestic unrest, he never wavered in his investment in the shadow network. The question is whether the strategy ever had a plausible path to the outcomes he intended. Hezbollah never destroyed Israel. Hamas did not liberate Palestine. The Houthis did not redraw the map of the Arabian Peninsula. And Iran, whose oil wealth and population should have made it one of the most prosperous nations in Asia, remained outside the world's top 100 countries in per capita income, its people paying the price of a grand regional strategy that, in the end, produced chaos without conquest resistance, without resolution, and a legacy defined not by what was built but by how much was sacrificed in the attempt to build it. Khamenei liked to say that the future belongs to Islam. He spent his entire adult life trying to make that future arrive on his terms. What he left behind was a Middle East more fractured, more exhausted, and more dangerous than the one he had inherited, and a nation of 90 million people whose greatest misfortune perhaps was to have been governed for so long by a man whose vision was grand enough to reshape a region and whose judgment was flawed enough to leave nothing standing at the end of it.
Most Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, holds ultimate authority in the Islamic Republic.
This one tells you what he actually built and why the Middle East will never be the same because of it. If you want to understand the hidden architecture behind every major conflict from Lebanon to Yemen to Gaza, this is the video that connects every piece together. Hit subscribe because the next chapter of this story is already unfolding and you need the full picture to understand what comes next.